All right. We are in chapter 40. We're all on the right page now, right? Chapter 40 of Genesis 40. Genesis chapter 40. We are looking at Joseph interprets the dreams. Last week we looked at Joseph and Potiphar's wife. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I talked about how it's important that we protect ourselves. You know, I thought it was interesting that God pointed out in his word and no other man was present. You know, to kind of show that point that we got to be careful where we're at and make sure we protect ourselves. Joseph, of course, still in prison, and chapter 40 it's given an interesting task of interpreting dreams. Now, I bet that was an interesting ability. You know, just to hear a dream and know what it's about. And of course, he tells us in his word, and we'll see here, but God tells us that, you know, the dreams come, the interpretation comes from God and not from Joseph. But let's pick up in verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass after these things, after the things of chapter 39, that the butler of the king of Egypt, which more like a servant, and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt." We have no clue what they did to offend the king. I mean, I can imagine maybe the butler didn't make his tea right or didn't bring him something the right way because, you know, kings were finicky. You know, if you didn't do something right, you were on a chopping block. Maybe the baker burned his muffins. You know, we don't know what they did. But whatever they did, it was bad enough that it just made him mad. And like I said, he could have been on a short fuse that day. Y'all ever got mad at stuff one day that you normally won't get mad at because you're having a bad day? You know, so just pointing fingers around here. So possibly that was it. We really don't know. But we know that they offended the king in some way. Verse 2 says, "And Pharaoh was wroth." Now, the word wroth means he was in a fit of rage. I mean, he was angry about what had happened. It says, "Wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers." So he was mad at the baker. He was mad at the butler. He was mad at the chief of the baker and the chief of the butler and his officers. I mean, somebody messed up. Somebody messed up somewhere. It says, "And he put them in the ward," or the prison area, "in the house of the captain of the guard, and to the prison, a place where Joseph was bound." It's not a coincidence they put him in the same place Joseph was. God had a plan here. "And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward." In other words, he put Joseph in charge of taking care of them, watching them, you know, basically made Joseph a guard to take care of these two people. So as we noticed last week, even though Joseph is in prison at this time, he still has a lot of favor, not only with the king, of course, we'll see later on, but now he's got favor with the guards at the prison, that they put him in a position of authority to watch over the prisoners. Now in verse 5 it says, "And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison." Do you ever notice some verses are kind of repetitive? They dreamed a dream. Okay, so they had some kind of dream in their minds. Each man had this dream at the same night, and it was according to the interpretation of the dream. So God's kind of given us a look ahead of time and said their dream was according to the interpretation that you're about to receive in the word here. The butler, the baker, they were both down in prison. "And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad." Why do you think they were sad? In prison. Maybe their dream made them sad. And we'll look at that in a minute and see why their dream would have made them sad. It says that he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of the Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there's no interpreter of it. So they were sad because they had a dream, but yet they don't know what the dream means. Y'all ever had that happen? How many of us dream? All of us. You ever wake up in the middle of the night and be like, what did that mean? You know, what was the dream trying to say? I mean, I don't know. He's like, no, I just dreamed it. I don't know if God uses dreams nowadays or not. And he did in the Old Testament because they didn't have the word of God. You know, he could speak to them that way. But they said, we had this dream and we don't know what it means. And there's nobody there to interpret it. And I like what Joseph says. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to who? God. He said, look, there's no interpreter here, but don't you know that all interpretations belong to God? I mean, if God is all knowing, he knows why you dreamed what you dreamed. So he says here, tell me then, I pray you. The word pray here means I beg you, I desire for you to tell me. The chief butler told him his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. So his dream is he sees this vine come up, and the vine has these 3 branches coming off of it. And the branch begins to do what? Begins to bud. Then it begins to produce grapes and clusters from it. And then he sees Pharaoh's cup in his hand, and he begins to squeeze those grapes and make grape juice for Pharaoh. What do you think his dream means? Got 3 days in jail. What else? Back in his regular position. I mean, God is literally telling him here, this is what's going to happen within the next little bit. So let's see what Joseph says. I said Daniel because he interprets dreams. So if I say Daniel, I'm sorry. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. So he says, you are going to go right back to where you were. The 3 branches represented 3 days. The fact that the cup was in his hand represented he is going to once again serve the king. So that was great news for the butler. But then there's a request here, verse 14. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness. I pray thee unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. He said, look, once you're in good favor again with the king, and you're kind of having a good time, make sure you tell the king about it. Make sure you remind him, man, I was brought here away from my family, away from my friends, into a foreign land. And when I got here, I did nothing wrong and ended up in prison. He says, so please remember me when you get there. So in verse 16, the baker begins to tell his dream. And of course, the baker's sitting here like, man, this is good. I mean, the butler had an interpretation, and the butler's go back to where he's at. Man, I'm looking forward to this. Look what it says in 16. For the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good. He said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream. And behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh. And the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. His dream's not as glorious, if you want to say it. He says, I had a dream, I had 3 white baskets on top of my head. The top basket was full of all kind of meats. What was happening to the meats? Birds were eating it. There was nothing glorious in that vision there. So let's see what he says. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Again, we got 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree. That's a little different than being lifted up and put back in your position, right? He says he's going to lift you up, and he's going to hang you from a tree. Now look what happened. Well, that's not it. And the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. So the birds were eating the meat from on top of his head. Was an interpretation of what? They're going to eat his flesh. So his dream was a nightmare. It wasn't good. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, and he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among the servants. He restored the chief butler into his butlership again, and gave the cup into the Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker. That was not a good ending to a story. That's not really what you want to happen. It says, as Joseph had interpreted to them, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. That's sad. Didn't remember him. That's by far for the course. But let's think about it. It's all in God's plan that Joseph's here. And then he finds out he has this ability to interpret dreams, by God's power. And he wants to get out of here, but yet when he has the chance to get out of there, the baker or butler doesn't tell what he was supposed to tell. So Joseph's stuck here. But it's a blessing in disguise, because the next dream he interprets is whose? Pharaoh's, which is going to then put him back into favor with Pharaoh. So even though it looks like Joseph's just getting, flopped from side to side and nothing good happening in his life, it's actually everything is working up to what he is going to receive when he interprets a dream for Pharaoh, which we're going to look at next week. I don't know how I got through that in one period of time.